Yeah, and something like this is so
Good evening.
We were a long way from them, so.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you for coming this evening. And on behalf of everyone at the Fletcher School at Tufts University, I'm really pleased to be able to welcome our friends from the American Academy of Diplomacy, and especially warm welcome to the Academy's President, Ronald Newman. Thank you very much for being here. There's no more important time really to refresh Fletcher's partnership with the Academy, dedicated as it is to the strengthening of American diplomacy. I'd also like to extend a very warm welcome to Dr. Carol Sisco, whom we are very pleased to welcome here, and it's a great honor for us to have you with us tonight, so thank you very much for being here. Joseph J. Sisco served as the chairman of the American Academy of Diplomacy from 1999 to 2004. After his passing, Carol, along with the Sisco Family Fund, worked with the Academy to create the Sisco Memorial Forum, a periodic series of events dedicated to the discussion of important themes in US foreign policy. Fletcher last co-hosted this forum with the Academy in 2016, sort of, before times. And we're really honored to be able to do so again tonight. Fletcher and the AAD enjoy a long-standing relationship, one that's based on, I hope, a shared appreciation of the importance of expanding the field of diplomatic education and training for this fast evolving world. There are many Fletcher alums who have been members of the AAD, including notably the beloved Ambassador Thomas Pickering from the famous class of 47, one of America's leading diplomats of his time and one of the greatest thinkers and advocates for strong American diplomacy since his retirement. He was, until very recently, the Academy's chairman. Two former Fletcher deans, Admiral James Stavridis and Ambassador Stephen Bosworth, have both been members of AAD. The AAD membership then extends to include many other icons of our alumni and of American diplomacy, from Walter Cutler, Thomas Boyatt, Barbara Bodine, Mary Bruce Warlick, James Warlick, Roberta Jacobson, Philip Zecco, and I go on. We look forward to building upon our relationship with the Academy later this fall through our new collaboration on a podcast series, The General and the Ambassador, as well as additional programming which we will co-curate. Tonight's conversation is going to focus on great power competition in a polycentric world in the middle of a polycrisis. So it's my pleasure to be able to welcome such an extraordinary panel, and we're really going to benefit from their insights and from the conversation we have with them. So Ambassador Aurelia Brazeal, thank you very much for being here. And I just want to shout out Ambassador Brazeal because she plays a very important role, has played a very important role over many years in the stewardship of the Wrangel Fellows. And here at Fletcher, our Pickering Fellows and our Wrangel Fellows are so important to our mission, and then they go on and make such a difference in the world. So thank you for that. And to Ambassador Kathleen Doherty, thank you so much for being here. We can't wait to hear your perspectives. And sitting to the far left with a Fletcher tie on, Admiral James Foggo. I do believe that your son endured the tuition of the teaching of Professor Rocky White. So you get many awards. But more seriously, it's very important that we have three such speakers, and I will allow my friend Ronald Newman to be able to introduce them specifically. But I just want to point out that on Friday at Convocation, we heard from Jeff Feltman about his career as a bilateral diplomat and then pivoting to become a multilateral diplomat, and what the two skill sets involve and how different, but all the strains of those two disciplines, which are the same, and the things that are different. And there's a recent report that's been published by the Academy on America's multilateral diplomacy, something which is sorely overlooked as a committed multilateralist, you'll forgive me for saying, too many times. I think this is such a timely publication, and actually reading through it over the last couple of days, I think just a very important, there's a number of very important points in there about what it means for the United States at this particular moment in time to exercise a robust multilateral diplomacy alongside what we hope will be a more strategic and more robust bilateral diplomacy. So you don't need me to explain how complicated the world is, but I think it will be interesting to hear what that might look like from Washington based on the experience of the three panelists. I also have just spotted at the back of the room our Dean Emeritus, Jess Salacuse. You're extremely welcome. It is lovely to see you again back on campus. So with that, I'm going to hand over now to Ambassador Newman to introduce today's panelists and to provide his own welcome. This is a great event and I'm very pleased to see. Oh, and sorry, now this is always the danger, right? So I do also want to acknowledge our Emeritus Professor of Diplomatic History, Anna Henriksen. You're very welcome to be here tonight. Thank you very much. To the other members of the Academy that are here, thank you very much. To the other members of our faculty, thank you. The floor is yours, please.
Thank you. Thank you. I'll talk from here, but I just wanted to say thank you. Thank you very much. That was actually one of the most eloquent and knowledgeable introductions I can remember hearing in a long time, and I was impressed you have done your homework. That's well, it doesn't always happen. So thank you very much, Dean Kite, for really not just the formulaic thank you for those warm words, but genuinely. And it's a pleasure to be back. And I was going to explain the Sisco Forum, but you've already done that. But we are terribly grateful to Carol Sisco and the Sisco Family Foundation for having provided with contributions. Actually, they never just gave us funding, they gave us incentives to get members to contribute so that we collectively built up the funds to make this a recurring event, and it's been a very successful one. I should say a couple words about the Academy because it's a strange little organization. It will be 40 years in existence next year. It was founded by people like Henry Kissinger and Ellsworth Bunker. George Kennan was a member of the founding members class. It was deliberately small. It still is small. I like to think that we are elite, but I hope not elitist, which is an attitude and not a qualification. And it really, as it's evolved over the years, it has several sort of orientations. One is talking to people about why diplomacy is important and what is diplomacy. Because so often you find people will say, yes, diplomacy is important, and they believe it. And at that point, they've exhausted their knowledge of the subject. And if you want people to fund something, they probably have to know a little more about it. So that's one area. Another area is, and the podcast and other things fall into that kind of general basket. But another area is talking to the State Department about what we think they could do better, periodic studies. The difference between the Academy and a university or a think tank, somewhat simplified, is basically with the university, when they have published the study, the project is done. In our case, we often gone ahead to lobby for the inclusion of the project. And so our big concern for several years is that American diplomats are becoming much too restricted to working out of heavily fortified embassies, not getting out enough into communities. They talk to the government, they don't always talk as we think they should to opposition leaders, to civil society, to opposition, all kinds of groups. And so we've been pushing that, and we feel that won't be a sufficient element, but an essential, necessary element is to change a law. And not everybody probably is old enough to remember the Benghazi hearings, but most people in this room are. And that was all revolved around something called accountability review boards, which have come to be seen as we're going to find somebody at fault if something happens. And so our big project has been to try to change that law. And we've gotten pretty far. We have bipartisan legislation introduced in both houses of Congress. And it was all in the bill that was going to be marked up this week in the Senate and the House. State Department authorization, except the Republicans, the Democrats, the House are squabbling. They've pulled the bill. So we will either have a glorious success or we start over next year. And that's working in Congress. So that's what that's my spiel about the Academy and the end of the commercial interruption. What we're trying to do this evening, and we're certainly not going to do it all, but it has been kind of a staple of writing on diplomacy and things for the last several years that we've moved from a bipolar world into a polyarctic world, and multiple players, and your friends today won't necessarily be your friends tomorrow, at least not on specific issues. As the war in Ukraine has evolved, and as the tensions with China have moved forward, we are now increasingly in what in many respects looks again like great power competition. And it is, but it isn't the Cold War. It doesn't have the same ideological motivation. And the world in which it occurs is no longer the sort of bipolar or tripolar world of the Cold War, but this new polyarctic world. And you saw that particularly in the UN vote against Russia on the Ukraine, where you had a very large number of African nations, like 30 or 40 abstaining, forget the exact number. So the context in which this new great power diplomacy is occurring is very different. It's not about ideology in the same way it was, and it plays out against a very different world. And what that's going to look like, we don't know. I have with me three great colleagues to talk about different elements of this. I can assure you we're not going to answer the question tonight. We may manage to raise your confusion to a higher level of detail, but I think we will at least provoke some thinking. So Ambassador Brazeal has all kinds of firsts. She was the first American woman career foreign service officer to be promoted in senior foreign service, first American, Black American to be nominated as ambassador. And that was not just once, she did that 3 times to Micronesia, to Kenya, and to Ethiopia, which are important posts. And then she's done all kinds of other things and been dean of the management school and had this important role with the Wrangel program that you mentioned. And I hope you have a bio someplace, so I'm not going to read it all. You know, very broad background with a lot of different areas. And then Ambassador Doherty was also, they're all distinguished. But, you know, you can hardly swing a dead cat in Washington without hitting retired ambassador. But Ambassador Doherty was ambassador to Cyprus. She was dean of the Foreign Service Institute. She's served in Brazil and Dominican Republic. She's particularly got a background in economic affairs, and as part of our working group in the Academy, trying to revitalize our American commercial diplomacy, where we feel that state and commerce are not performing adequately. And despite the fact there was a law passed last year that we actually helped to write, they're still not performing adequately. So she's very much part of that. And then because this new world is not simply an economic confrontation or simply a diplomatic confrontation or simply a military confrontation, but has elements of all three, we have Admiral Fogel, who is also a member of the Academy and who has served in a variety, naval graduate, has a lot of time in submarine forces, but we have him above surface here. But he has commanded Naval Forces Europe, Naval Forces Africa, and Allied Joint Force Command, NATO. So a lot of multinational experience from the military perspective as well. and he's now the Dean of the Center for Maritime Strategy at the Navy League of the United States. So we have the point is, we tried to have a very broad spectrum of backgrounds here. And then mine, and I probably will not be able to keep my mouth shut entirely, it is basically in the Middle East, the Persian Gulf, Afghanistan, and more on the political and military side of another area of the world, which is also troubled and which is also realigning itself and trying to figure out how it fits in an unstable world. And you see the realignment of Persian Gulf states, not only in the relationship that some of them have acquired with Israel, which is partly focused on Iran, but in sort of playing footsie with Russians and looking for other partners because they don't trust the Americans, and yet they can't find anybody that could replace the Americans. That's just one more symptom of what we're going to be talking about tonight. So I'm going to start with Ambassador Doherty, talking about changes and challenges to global economic order. What I've asked each of my colleagues to do is really just take 10 minutes or so to give you some high points and sort of get your thinking warmed up. We're not, we could easily do an entire seminar on any one of the areas that we're dealing with here. But what we want is to sort of provoke you, and hopefully we've designed this so we'll actually have time for questions. I know that I'm sure many of you have also, as I have, sat in things where people say, we really want to hear you on this. And then after they're all done talking, there's 15 minutes, and there's one long question, sometimes rather pompously delivered by somebody who wants to prove they too are an expert, after which you get a long-winded answer, and then we're done. We'll try to do a little better than that. Kathleen, over to you.
Well, that's quite a setup. It's great. It's great to be part of this forum and with such esteemed colleagues. And before I start, I'll just do 2 points of reference that's probably relevant to why I'm going to speak about the topics. I was an economic officer in the Department of State. I did a lot on money laundering, and I had kind of this strange moniker being the dirty money expert, Russian money laundering in particular, and oligarchic money. I also worked on energy issues. So I'm going to tee up my discussion and say I'm going to talk about 3 different areas. One is the big question is, will sanctions hold against Russia? That's a big question. Second is the US weaponizing the dollar by using such a very robust sanctions regime. And then third, in this kind of geopolitical world, what happens with US companies and global companies in markets like Russia and China? So I'm going to try to touch on each of these issues as succinctly as possible to give you an idea, and then I hope we do have time for questions. First, let me go to the sanctions. I have worked on sanctions issues throughout my career, and everyone says, well, sanctions don't work. They don't change behavior. And that's true, but they are meant to be punitive. And I think what we're seeing right now is a very effective punitive actions that have been taken by most Western countries, United States, European Union, Australia, and other countries, which we'll talk about, others that did not take sanctions against the Russian regime. And well, you've not seen any significant impact on the Russian economy. You're starting to see it fray. And there was a document that was just leaked a couple of days ago that Bloomberg reported on what the Russian economy will look like next year. At the very minimum, they project a very significant contraction. They're saying that Russia will not return to pre-Ukraine war GDP until the end of the decade. The stock market capitalization is 40%. It is significant, and you're going to start seeing the ramifications. What Putin has been able to do is benefit from high energy prices and people wanting to buy it. And we'll talk about China and India shortly about that. Putin has raised the stakes and said, we're going to cut off gas to Europe this winter. It was a miscalculation, as many miscalculations have been done by the Russian leader. Europe has been going and canvassing the world to get gas, and it's been very effective. And European gas reserves are almost at a historic high. So even if it's a brutal winter, which it could very well be, brutal in terms of cold and temperature and demand, and a lot of people are saying it's going to be the winter of discontent, I still believe that sanctions will hold for a number of reasons. One, you cannot stop sanctions in the middle of a war. You cannot stop sanctions when Ukrainians have had such battlefield successes and are dying still. You can't stop sanctions now because if you stop sanctions during an active war, we never can do sanctions again. We have defanged it as a policy tool. So you have to keep it up. What I don't think will happen, I don't think we'll have new sanctions. I think the appetite for more extensive sanctions has probably been reached. What we will see, I think, is, and we're starting already seeing just today, doing what we call secondary sanctions, which means we're going to put sanctioning individuals and companies and countries that support Russia. And we've sanctioned 5 Chinese companies already. We're talking about Turkish banks that are fueling and supporting Russia. And that's is what the world did against Iran. And that ended up being more effective than primary sanctions, because once you cut off that lifeline, then you start having a greater ramification. So I believe that sanctions will endure. They will continue throughout the foreseeable future. And I think there was a big miscalculation that sanctions fatigue will set in. What we do see, though, a lot of people are talking about, is the US weaponizing the dollar? And what does that mean? Are we leveraging the fact that the US is at its historic high, literally in 40 years, to make the effect of sanctions even more powerful? And the answer is yes. The sanctions would not be as effective if the US dollar was not as high. The fact that Putin has about $300 billion in US dollars frozen that he cannot tap is really significant. And this dollar is rising in relation to other currencies. You know, I was shocked that the British pound is at the same rate as 1985. And I'm going to age myself. I was still in college in 1985. That's how long ago it was when the British pound, the euro is at its lowest rate since the time was introduced. Australia, Singapore, Canadian money is all at the lowest rate of the US. So that becomes, the dollar becomes a powerful tool in compelling behavior. But what is it doing? And that's the question right now. And what you're starting to see is the rise of alternative payment systems. You've heard that we sanctioned Russia and we kicked Russian banks out of the SWIFT process and out of the clearinghouse. So the Chinese are now buying Russian grain, Russian energy supplies, Russian technology through its own alternative payment systems. The Indians are doing the same. The Saudis are looking about doing that. And people are saying, is this going to mean that by providing alternatives to the US financial system, are we ultimately going to weaken the US dollar and dethrone it as the king of currencies? And that's likely to happen, but not immediate. The dollar is too strong. Most global transactions are still linked to the dollar. Most reserves, the US dollar is still 60% of global reserves. It's 2 times what the euro is. So I say the dollar's dominance is going to continue for a significant amount of time, but it is giving an impetus to these alternative systems that are rising. It's also giving impetus to countries like China, who would love to would like to enhance the Chinese RMB to be a reserve currency. And there has been some move into the Chinese reserve currency. It's about 3% now of global exchange, but it's up from 1%. But China is 15% of global trade. So there's still a disproportionate ratio to it. And the Chinese currency is not fully convertible. So until it's fully convertible, it will not challenge the US dollar. Now, all of you who are economists in the room also know there's bad things about the US dollar being so high. It hurts our exporters and it makes us addicted to imports. And that's really going to hurt us. We're going to hit a crisis point at some point where our exports won't be competitive anymore because of the high price of dollars. And we are going to be addicted to imports. If the US dollar starts losing its strength, it also hurts the US economy. It means our debt is higher. We can't leverage our debt, and we end up becoming it. So if you were the Fed or a US president trying to figure out what the ideal level of the dollar is, it is like a bullet symbol, like throwing a dartboard right now, trying to figure out what the ideal is. But right now, having a very powerful US dollar is incredibly effective in terms of sanctions and in putting the pressure on Putin. Just to go a little bit further, a lot of people are also saying this is going to drive the adoption of digital currencies, because digital currencies, like the Chinese digital currency and cryptocurrencies, are impervious to US financial systems. They are outside the systems, they're outside of sanctions. So if you really wanted to encourage a way to get away from the US financial system, you go into cryptocurrencies and digital currencies. The problem is there's also a mismatch in timing. Digital currencies, and while they're still being used, they're in their growing pains right now. They're not really sophisticated, they're not widely used. So while they might be an alternative to the dollar in 5 to 10 years, they're not an alternative to the dollar right now. So again, I go back to the fact that the dollar will remain the king of currencies for a while. Now, how does that play out in terms of our relationship? It is creating a lot of resentment in the world too, because countries that are heavily indebted and dollar-denominated debt also is really resentful to the US because of the high level of dollars. So long-term effects, what does that mean for the global South, as my colleague might talk about, and the resentment to the US? There's a lot of resentment about the US using its one of its final power economic tools is the strength of the dollar. So I'm going to put that aside for a moment, and then I'm going to talk about what it means for the future in terms of where we're going in geopolitics in the markets. I think many of you probably watched with interest today, as I did, the President Xi, President Putin meeting. I didn't see anything there. There was a lot of very superficial aspects of support for each other, but I thought was very noticeable the absence of some words. President Xi did not talk about Russia's security interests. He did not talk about Ukraine. He did not talk about sanctions. And I think this is really very important to think, because China still wants to work within the international financial system. And China is worried about Chinese banks getting caught up on our sanctions and coming crosswise with the US financial system. So China is really trying to strike a very important middle road to show its support for the Russians, but not to create a greater adversarial relationship with the US, which is already confrontational adversarial. So I was really impressed by the very calculated nuance of President Xi's position. And if you were to read anything into it, you can read anything into it or nothing into it. And that was, I think, extremely effective diplomacy on his part. Whereas if you saw President Putin, it was almost kind of almost a sense of need to have the reassurance by the Chinese that the Chinese is going to be by the side. And again, the very interesting dynamics. And I think this will be pulled apart and videos will be watched. And, people spend lifetimes trying to look at body language and trying to figure out what happened. But today was also an important day in terms of our relationship with China. And if you had looked at the newspapers, the Biden administration is taking a much more hard-nosed approach to Chinese technology. And this is where you're starting to see the geopolitics play out. And today, the president announced that he will be starting to use the CFIUS process. If those of you may not know, it's the Committee for the Foreign Investment in the United States, of which I've done a lot of work in my life on it, about Chinese investment in the US. And the US government is going to start scrutinizing much more carefully Chinese investment in the high sensitive sectors like quantum computing, artificial intelligence, smart batteries. And this is the new battlefield. This is where I see everything's going to come ahead, is the tensions over technology. And what is driving both the US administration and the Chinese administration, and what their ultimate goal is. And this is where US companies and multinational companies are going to get caught up. I think we've seen a real escalating tit for tat between China and the United States in terms of use of technology. US companies and multinationals are getting very nervous about whether they should stay in China and continue doing business in China. There was a recent poll of Fortune 500 companies done in May, and 61% are reevaluating their portfolio and operations in China. Part of it is the geopolitics, And I'll go back to that in a minute. But part of it's also China's own, yeah, I'll wrap it up in just two things. China's own policies, the zero tolerance approach, the rise of a surveillance state, and a weakening economy in China is actually making a lot of global companies really scared. They're also getting very nervous about how the US reach on technology will affect them. So I gave you a really brief overview of all these different trends going on. I hope it will spark some questions.
We're really big and we could really irritate a whole lot of people. One
Yes.
thing I took away from, but now we're going to swing
Oh, yeah.
the perspective to Ambassador Brazeal to look from the global south, and she has free hand because she could talk for 2 hours on this, but we'll constrain her. But so, Marie, over to you.
Thank you very much. And my mandate was to comment on how the global south might react to this new great power competition. And that gives me sort of most of the rest of the world, like the developing world to speak about. So I think I'll focus on Asia and Africa, and Ron is going to Ambassador Newman is going to talk about the Middle East. Thank goodness. So thank you. And I didn't even touch the Indian subcontinent area because that was, but I'm going to throw in the Pacific Islands as well, because I think that's an area that's overlooked. Really, to me, the global south is going to react the same way it reacted in the Cold War, and the same way it's reacting now to just changing circumstance, which is to look out for its own interest and to keep a desire for autonomy. And so they don't want to align with the US or with the Chinese or the Russians. And just an aside on the Chinese and Russians, I was thinking, and hearing the description of the meeting today, that most of you weren't alive probably in the 70s, but when the Chinese and Russians met back in the 70s, it was Russia on top as sort of the major power, and the Chinese were sort of the little brother, and it's completely different now. So to me, that's what struck me about that meeting today, that whole dynamic has changed. But I think if the global south sees the US domestic debates settled in favor of addressing our economic and social and cultural challenges head on, the US will get back to funding. And if we get back to funding such drivers for economic prosperity, like public education, infrastructure, innovation, R&D, immigration, and the like, and working multilaterally with our allies and friends, to build more of a unifying definition of a global common good, then I think their concerns about the competition with China and throw in Russia will be lessened. Africa, China has most of the debt across developing countries. It's either held by China or by private investors. And the World Bank estimates that in 2022, 1/3 of debt service payments by the 74 poorest countries in the world are owed to China. So, and if you think back to the start of this century, in the year 2000, most of that debt was held by Paris Club members and multilateral organizations. So there's a difference. Of course, there's debt trap politics that affect the global south. And that has to be taken into consideration. Some areas in Africa, not so much Latin America yet, although there are a few countries there, recognize these traps, but the Caribbean also has a large debt with China. And so there's some rumblings I hear in the global south that China is using the debt trap policies toward countries that are Black or brown. And that's not to China's positive image at all. But one has to look where that debt is distributed, but there's a racial overtone that is coming in now. Russia is demanding their degree of global influence And they're using the fact that they're an arms supplier, an energy supplier, and mercenary supplier. They've got the Wagner Group working in Africa. They're fertilizer suppliers, food suppliers, things that are needed in the developing world. And they also sort of try to remind countries that they were there supporting anti-colonial movements early on. And so there's sort of a tradition of friendship, but they're using sort of, what shall I say, bribery and corruption. For example, they're smuggling gold out of Sudan to finance the war with Ukraine. And and the Wagner Group is being used to do that. So they're around doing things in the global South, but they're using disinformation and money to destabilize elections as well, and to influence publics. And so I guess that gets back to African countries. They don't want to be caught between China and the US. And there's an African proverb that it's always repeated to me, that when elephants fight, it's the grass that suffers. And so they don't want to suffer. And China is becoming more aggressive on the commercial diplomacy side because of the debt they carry and the ability to penalize some countries and businesses if they buy US systems or goods, or other goods as well, because there's competition for raw materials. So some academics argue that Russia or Africa can use great power rivalry to its advantage. And this is what they've been doing all along to me. They avoid the zero-sum game by saying they don't want to be pawns in a proxy rivalry. And they say they want strategically to have partnership diversification. And then they play one country off against the other. And then they want, if they're smart, they'll make sure the loans or the grants or the donations fit their national development plans and are not duplicative, and that they are sector oriented depending on their sector plans. They have had students now studying around the world out of Africa and Russia and China and the US and elsewhere. And so they can really start using that built-in expertise, I think, of the students having returned to increase their cultural competency and understanding of how to negotiate with the various groups, emerging powers, US, China, and Russia. So that they have the ability, but to avoid the fray. In terms of what they said about the abstentions, I think there were 35 abstentions by 15 from Africa on condemning the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And then 58 abstentions on removing Russia from the UN Human Rights Commission. They weren't all African, but people focused in on Africa. And the feedback I received from African friends, as well as official statements, primarily by the South Africans, was that they found it very patronizing to try to get the African countries to criticize Russia. And they wouldn't be bullied by being told that it's either choose condemnation or else. And so the language that people use is very important. And the Chinese are very good about using soft language. And unfortunately, our more recent history in the US, particularly in the previous administration, was to dictate and overly dictate. So I suggest that we insert a degree of modesty in our in our future endeavors. But so the Africans are, they're also building up some resentment, I should say, of US and global reaction to the war in Ethiopia, which started before the Russians invaded Ukraine. And you hear things like, we've given $3+ billion to Ukraine. and we haven't given anything to Ethiopia. Depending on what side of the Ethiopian equation you're on. Today, I just got text after text from friends because Eritrea, for example, Isaiah has mobilized everybody from age 55 down, including women and men, to come and fight. In the Amhara region in Ethiopia, the same kind of cry was put out to have a mobilization. Tigray, as best I can tell, sees itself fighting for its survival the same way as Ukraine sees itself fighting for its survival. And yet it doesn't have the same kind of public profile and support. And so there's a growing frustration I hear from people about what is the US prepared to do, if anything, and also the UN and putting pressure. So there's a recognition, I think, that our more public profile racism that has come out over the past decade in this country has affected how our countries, the global South countries, are viewing the United States. And that has to be taken into account, in my view, as we move forward. In Latin America, you have China sort of picking up its actions there in this century. They use the Belt and Road, foreign direct investment. They've got free trade arrangements with Chile, Costa Rica, Peru. 20 Latin American countries have signed on to the Belt and Road initiative. They have strategic partnerships with Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Ecuador, Mexico, Peru, and Venezuela. And there are large Chinese populations in Peru, Brazil, Cuba, Paraguay, and Venezuela. So the sort of lower profile US activity in Latin America has opened the door since really, depending on how one would look at it, over much of this century, has allowed the Chinese to move in a big way and into the Caribbean, as I said, with the Belt and Road. And many people see, not many people, I see the Belt and Road as and agree with some analysts, that it's a way for China to project its global blue water desires, because they can get to ports and they can have transportation setups and maybe even some bases, as we've seen in Africa and Djibouti. So it's commercially oriented, but it's really, to me, reflective of their global aspirations for becoming the sole superpower at some point, which could happen. We had the US Latin American Summit in June, and that in Los Angeles. There were some people who did not come. Mexico's president did not attend, although I must say that President Biden and the Mexican president have met face-to-face twice in the last 8 months. So you can't put too much emphasis on the fact that he didn't show up for the summit per se. But I think I guess in trying to look at different parts of the world for this presentation, I became even more in awe of the US diplomats who are still out there working, overly working now, because they're doing so much in so many different parts of the world, in so many countries, trying to sort of repair what we did to ourselves in the previous administration, in terms of pulling back and not dialoguing and not participating in the global community. So my hat's off to them. But the summit, I think, produced what is going to call the year of action. And we might see again some multilateral efforts there to try to move things forward. If you look at each region of the global South, Africa, Latin America, even Pacific Islands, they have the Pacific Island Forum. You have ASEAN, if you look at in Asia. There are regional organizations that should be exploited, in my view, in the sense that you all as future diplomats will have the members, and hopefully the US will be participating, but have the members can come up with ideas for example, the environmental studies that have to be done if the Chinese want to build a road in Bolivia that's going to destroy a community and set off huge internal migration of people, how that should be looked at. So if you can get the rules agreed to through regional organizations, then I think we have a way of creating that global common good definition that I would like to see. But I'll just move to the Pacific a bit. I was ambassador to the Federated States of Micronesia back in 1990. The Chinese had an ambassador there already. They've been working in the Pacific for 30, 40, 50 years now. They're out there. We have to, the US to me has to extend its timeline. We need to be looking at things 30, 20 years at least out, and 30 years hopefully. And not in the American short term, next month this has to happen kind of thing. The Chinese are patient. They were out there, they have relationships. To me, we're putting our efforts, the US is putting its efforts in Papua New Guinea, and we can also do the Micronesian areas where we have a compact of free association where we can use the land and waters freely for our national security interests. The compacts have to be renegotiated. They expire next year and the year after. And I haven't even detected a heartbeat of a negotiation, so I'm not sure what's going on. But in any event, the global South is going to maneuver and try not to align with one or the other of the great powers. That's the bottom line to me there. We have to be selective and pick out some countries in different regions and move things along. We have to work multilaterally, particularly with regional organizations, because I think we can get somewhere. And I'll stop there.
Thank you. I think as we move along, I think one of the things that people are maybe hearing underneath these is how complicated this is, how many different themes there are out there. And when you think about it in terms of a government reacting, responding, and responsibility comes up to actually only a very few people. It's enormously difficult to delegate really big issues in governance, because at the end of the day, the president, is responsible. He can get somebody else to take actions, but if it's too big and it's messed up, he's responsible. And so you get, you add in this multiplicity of issues, and then you think about the limits of human bandwidth to focus on them, and the problems of bringing these things up to resolution, how you organize to deal with it. You have a huge problem. And now we haven't even touched the most, I might say, explosive issue, which is the military dimension, for which I'm going to turn to Admiral Fogo. Just in this year, the fighting in Ukraine, what we've seen about how wrong our calculations have been on the quality of the Russian military, on how fast we were going to use up all the munitions and stocks that we have, what we're going to have to do to rebuild, what that means if we're really getting serious about China and doing it all at once. And not to mention, of course, what's happening in the Persian Gulf, and where every so often people think it'd be swimming to have a military attack with Iran. So we have a few complications. Admiral Fogo, over to you.
Thank you, sir. If you don't mind, I'm going to take the podium. I do better standing up. And will you be able to flip for me? Or anyway, we'll figure that out. Thanks very much, Dean Kite, for this opportunity, and the American Academy of Diplomacy and Carol,
I know he's got
for your
slides,
generosity. I'm no stranger to Fletcher. I wear the tie. I'm not a graduate. I went to that other place, Kennedy School. But my son and my daughter-in-law are both graduates of the MALT program. It's absolutely a fantastic experience. So I know what you're going through, and congratulations. And it's great to see you again, shipmate. Last time I saw him was in Georgia, and he's back here for his PhD. That's great. So this photo we just talked about is iconic because it is the meeting at Sochi. I'm sorry, at the Olympics in Beijing between President Putin and President Xi. And at that time, President Xi was complicit because Putin talked to him about the invasion of Ukraine. He knew about it. He didn't do anything about it except say, don't do it until after the closing ceremony. But Xi is watching what's going on in Ukraine very carefully, especially with regards to his weather eye on Taiwan. And I believe that Xi, as Ambassador Doherty says, has realized that he does not want to be and understands the ramifications of being on the wrong side of history. So there is hope. Now, we're talking great power competition here today. So let's start with the Russia problem first. Next slide. Let's see if that works. Is there a clicker here? Oh, it's okay. That's easy. I'll do that. Thank you. So if you're wondering where the bubbles are coming from, I'm a submariner. That is the oxygen generator overboard valve that blows bubbles into the water when you're not in a situation where you don't want anybody to hear you. So I thought I'd throw that up there for you. The picture on the left. So I'm a product of the Naval Academy, but I'm a Cold Warrior. So I have some background here and I want to share that with you. The picture on the left is me on the USS Sea Devil in 1985 as a lieutenant surfacing at the North Pole. That was in the middle of the third battle of the Atlantic. That was in the middle of the Cold War. And at that time, we realized that without firing a shot through a cost-imposing strategy, we could bring the Soviet Union to its knees. And they broke in 1991. You know, Francis Fukuyama in '89 wrote The End of History. We all thought it had happened and there was going to be a peace dividend, but guess what? It didn't happen. And so the next photo on the right, a 16-year hiatus later, circled, that's me. I'm the commanding officer of USS Oklahoma City, and we're in the same place. Different submarine, same place, high north, near the North Pole. What did I notice? Three different things. What did I notice that was different? One, less ice. We have a problem with climate change. And your dean has led some significant efforts on this, and I laud you, ma'am, for that. More pollution. I was shocked. The Azure blue water, just like this, full of plastics, right near the North Pole. I mean, I was shocked. I didn't see that the last time I was there. And the Russians were back. I've written extensively about the fourth battle of the Atlantic, and we're in it. It's raging right now. Magnus Nordeman came out and did a story on us when we were at Sixth Fleet. Next slide. I guess I got it. Okay, why does a Fletcher student need to know about Russian submarines? Well, the first one here on the left, that's the Severod Vents, very capable. And it can make it all the way over to the east coast of the United States. They shoot Caliber cruise missiles, which are going into Ukraine, and they shoot Zircon hypersonics. And Putin has threatened to use them against us. We thought it was propaganda before the campaign in Ukraine. I'm not so sure now. The next submarine, though, is the one that really scares me. That's the Belgorod. It has two missions. It has a Poseidon-class nuclear-powered, potentially nuclear-tipped torpedo. Putin leaked this himself to the press. And its target is us here in the United States. But even worse, that little mini sub right there, that's a nuclear-powered mini sub that can threaten our undersea critical infrastructure. So why is that important to you? There it is. Now, you all have cell phones and laptops and computers, and you use Wi-Fi and you connect on the internet. 95% of our global transactions, financial transactions, and our military secure communications travel via those undersea cables. It's a sea line of communication that the master of sea power, Alfred Thayer Mahan, never conceived of in his lifetime, because these cables were just starting to be laid at the time that he died. Now, with all this Russian activity going on and brewing prior to the illegal annexation of Ukraine, you would think that it would have been no surprise that Putin invaded the Ukraine on February 24th, but it was. We missed signals. I call it the boiling frog scenario. I've written a lot about this too. What are the signals and what did we miss? And this is something for those of you who are MALDs or going to go into diplomacy, I think you want to pay attention to in the future, particularly with regard to what's going on in China right now. The Russian withdrawal, not 2014, but 2007, the Russian withdrawal from the Conventional Forces Europe Treaty in 2007, soft withdrawal in 7, hard withdrawal in 14. That was a signal. The illegal annexation of Ukraine in 2014. The strangulation of Mariupol and Ukrainian ports in the Sea of Azov with an outdated treaty from 2003. The completion of the Kerch Bridge, and the circle was complete. Putin was the first guy to drive a truck across that bridge in 2016, and they restricted commerce going up in there to damage the economy of Ukraine. The Ukrainian Mosquito fleet incident in 2018, when 27 sailors got on 3 ships, tried to make it through the Kerch Bridge. They were rammed, they were shot at by the FSB, and all 27 ended up in one of Amnesty International's worst dungeons in the world in Moscow, charged with criminal charges, a complete violation of the Geneva Convention. They were wearing uniforms. They were not civilians. They had not committed a crime. It took 2 years to get them back. And then the carpet bombing of the Black Sea. Abuse, lawfare of the UN Convention on Law of the Sea. Jim Stavridis is a friend of mine. He wrote his PhD here on the UN Convention on Law of the Sea. And the purpose of these closure areas in blue is to notify people of military exercises. They run for about 2 weeks and then they come down. The Russians left these up for a year prior to invading Ukraine on 24 February. That should have been a signal to everybody. It violates the spirit and intent of UNCLOS. And furthermore, they have spoofed GPS, they have interfered with military exercises, they have spoofed the AIS automatic identification system for tracking both military and commercial ships. They claim they fired on Her Majesty's ship Defender during Sea Breeze in 2019. Again, the boiling frog. It's been going on for a very long time. And then they invaded Ukraine on 24 February. Look at the contrast between March and the territory the Russians occupied and today. Significant. They're not doing so well. Who is doing well? I think the courage and the valiance, that's a real stamp, by the way, after Snake Island, you guys know that. The courage and the valiant performance of Ukrainians is to be commended, but they can't do it without our help. And that is the debate, right? The pivot of the pirouette. Are we going to remain in Europe doing this for the foreseeable future, or are we going to pivot to the Western Pacific and address China? Now, if you look at one of my old PAOs who now works at Transcom, he did this slide in May. That's a lot of stuff. And that's not even all the stuff that's gone over there. The president just signed another drawdown authority, his 20th. So another $2.5 billion for a total of $13.5 billion since we started this from the United States. Some goes to Eastern Europe, a lot goes to Ukraine, $675 million in weapons to Ukraine just this past week. Think of what we could do with that money if we weren't fighting this war and supporting them. So the other part of the equation, China. And there are undoubtedly some students in the class who are from the PRC, so I would invite your opinion on my thesis and with your questions. So will China continue to be that cute little panda that's right off the Panda Cam? That's a real picture from Washington, DC. Or will China become a fire-breathing dragon and a full-blown adversary? I hope not. And we have long talked about a pivot to the Pacific. We're now confronted by 2 nuclear-armed adversaries, one in Europe, one in the Pacific, and we've got to decide what we're going to do, because we in the United States do not have enough stuff to fight a campaign in 2 different fronts right now. And that's a fact. But I want to share my experience with you in China and tell you that I think there's opportunities here, especially for diplomats, people like you, who might be able to work this out. And it starts with the Sunnyland Summit in 2013. I was in the Pentagon, fat, dumb, and happy as the Deputy Chief of Naval Operations for Strategy, Plans, and Policy. This happened, and Susan Rice called the CNO and said, CNO, one of the things that came out of Sunnylands is we're going to have negotiations on rules of behavior in the maritime domain, and the Navy will lead it. He called me. I was a budding 2-star. I wasn't wearing it yet. It was a 1-star. He said, Fogo, you're going to go to China and lead this negotiation. I thought, wow, that's cool. It's better than being submerged on a submarine and just buzzing around the ocean. So I was on a plane, and that's me, circled here at PLA Navy headquarters. And my chief interlocutor was Rear Admiral Lee G. He was charming and disarming. And people said, be careful, watch out for the Stockholm syndrome. He speaks English like an Oxford professor. And comes across as a really nice guy, but he represents his country. You have to represent yours. I said, I knew that. My blood flows red, white, and blue. The Chinese interpreter told me, Fogo Shangzhang. That's General Fogo. They don't have a word for admiral in Mandarin, apparently. Fogo Shangzhang. Li Ji, he is the chief barbarian handler. I was like, really? Who's the barbarian? You are, Fogo Shangzhang. And so I said, really? Wow. So we started this negotiation, and it took about 1 day to get bogged down. Arguments over words, just like arms control, churning the coffee, waiting for paint to dry. Li Ji was the one that broke the ice. He said to me, Fogo Shangzhang, do you know why we're here? In a private meeting. And I said, of course I do, to negotiate rules of behavior in the maritime domain, Admiral Li Ji. He said, no, that's not why we're here. We are here because if our two nations go to war, that is a decision for President Xi and President Obama, not a decision for men in the cockpit of an aircraft or on the bridge of a ship. That's why we're here. And you know what? It moved along very quickly after that. What I learned is that the Chinese are very concerned. Now, this is kind of like the Thucydides trap. What are the two things you need, Fletcher students, for the Thucydides trap? You need a nation on the rise against a hegemon and fear, right? Yeah, but true. So they have declared the 9-dash line. They build walls. That's the Great Wall of China. We've tried to build bridges. They're building a wall at sea. Harry Harris calls it the Great Wall of Sand. He's a friend of mine too. And the 9-dash line is the Sansha prefecture. So it's the largest prefecture in China, but the smallest amount of land. 7 islands centered around Sansha and Hainan Island. And it's all about territorial claims, fishing, mineral rights. It's a big mess. And China refuses to arbitrate at the UN Convention on Law of the Sea with its establishments. So despite all of that took place in that room as we negotiated, we got an agreement signed. And it was really the only thing that came out of Sunnyland in 2013. So Secretary Rice took it away from the Navy, elevated it to the 2 secretaries of defense. That's the signature of Chuck Hagel that took place at the Asean Summit in November of 2014. And guess who stood behind he and the Chinese defense minister while he signed it with their pens? President Xi and President Obama. So it was a fairly big deal. And you know what? I went off to be the 6th Fleet commander, and I left feeling pretty good about the relationship. I said, we figured out how to come up with a deal and to work together and to coexist in the Western Pacific. But I was wrong. Look at these numbers. So that was 2014. In 2015, the Chinese started a naval arms race to build 255 ships. Today, 360. How many does the US Navy have right now? 296. So they've got way more than we do, and they're going to 425. I ask, why? What threat do they think they have at sea? I don't really think it's us, but I'm biased because I'm a naval officer. Now, inside the 9-dash line, Subi Reef, South China Sea, time-lapse photography, 2012, 2018. These countries all contest that area. Taiwan, Korea, Philippines, and Vietnam. China just took it. Built a stationary aircraft carrier out there to extend their reach, and they defend it with real weapons. Nuclear weapons. Stratcom, my friend, Chaz Richard, he's a submariner just like me, 4-star active duty, says they're in a breakout. They have 350 nuclear warheads right now. They're adding 3,000 by 2030. 3,350 warheads. So those of you who have studied the New START Treaty, 1550 apiece for the United States and Russia. China will have more than both of us combined, and they are in no arms control scheme. That is very dangerous. They also have a hypersonic weapon already. So do the Russians. The Russians have used it in the Ukraine. We don't. We're building a prototype. So I'm very concerned about all this. Last couple slides. So how much do you need for national security? Our current defense budget is $773 billion, ladies and gentlemen. The Navy gets 30% of that. That's $232 billion, and that's not enough. That submarine on the top is the next generation deterrent, nuclear deterrent for our nation. It's the Columbia class. It's the most secure portion of the triad. It will save your bacon, and it will do whatever you've learned here about nuclear deterrence for this nation. But the Navy has been the one that has to pay for it. $16 billion for the first ship of the line. That's more than the aircraft carrier Ford. That's almost ridiculous. It's because of our industrial base and the way we build these ships. And so without more money, when we get an adjustment for 2% inflation, our buying power is down 7% from last year. We can't afford it. We can't afford to build other ships, which means we're going to go further into decline and further behind the Chinese and further unable to check any aggression that takes place out in the South China Sea or the Western Pacific. So we've got to come up with a better way to do this. We've got to figure out how we're going to do it. And we've got to figure out whether or not we're going to pivot or are we going to pirouette to avoid that Thucydides trap that I talked about. So I don't have the answers, but I think you do, because you're the generation that's going to save our country. And if you don't know about pivot or pirouette, I guess we could ask Nureyev. And that's my get off the stage slide. Thank you very much.
Well, I promised we could raise your
I did
confusion
too.
to a higher level of detail. So now it's your turn. I'm not going to take moderator's privilege and start off with questions. I'm going to let people in the audience start off, unless they're slow, in which case, of course, we can fill the bill. Diplomats can always talk. We have two microphones, one here, one there. And we have some people I hope that will come in on the Zoom as well. And I'm going to try to just rotate my way through. And if things are too slow, I will, of course, fill the gap. But you've heard a lot here. You've heard a lot of challenges, and we haven't even gotten to the enormous multinational challenges of, for instance, climate and the environment, and how this is going to impact, while we're off having our arms race, our competitions, and pivoting to new great power conflict, the world's still kind of going to hell there. And so over to you. First question.
Hi, my name is Chester Ang. I'm a second-year master's student here. First of all, thank you to the panel for a really thought-provoking discussion. I think we're all among us. We have a ton to talk about. My question is directed to Ambassador Brazeal. You talked a little bit about how African countries have been sending students abroad. Can you say more about the impact it has had in pursuing this as a strategy of, as you said, strategic partner diversification?
Sure. I'm not exactly sure of recent data, but I believe there are more African students studying in China now than there are in the United States. That, to me, is a travesty, and you've hit on something that's important to me. I've been working, when you're retired, you can do what you want, so to speak. And so I'm working with some friends actually from Ethiopia and elsewhere in Africa to put forward an idea of a United States university in Africa, located there, hopefully for a deliverable for the summit that's coming up in December. I don't know what's happening to all of that alchemy inside the government, but my idea was we had the Kennedy airlift of African students back in the 60s, President Kennedy, including President Obama's father, who was airlifted here to study, to go back and lead their countries. And so to me, it's time for us to go to the continent. And an American University of Africa, but not American University, but an American university in Africa, so that we're there because tertiary education is very valued in Africa. And they have a bulge of youth And so they need to be educated and have jobs. And so this is something I hope we can put together and announce. If we do, I'll take credit. If not, failure is an often, but you know, it's so important. So yes, so we need to do better in terms of education. That's one of our strong suits in the US, particularly university education, PhDs, masters, and we need to get going in Africa, in Africa. Yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but that's what I'm hoping will come out in December.
Rhea, do you see African nations putting money into this as well? You know, I was thinking of you've had an explosion of American universities in the Middle East, but of course, the places they have, I mean, you've got a few old traditional Beirut, Cairo, but so many of them are drawn because the Gulf states, for instance, have a lot of money and they put it into bringing American education into the Gulf.
Yes.
So
yes,
yeah.
The answer is yes, but also the philanthropic community. I've talked to some HBCUs. I'm a graduate of Spelman College, and our new president is gung-ho behind it because she has an international background, among other things. I mean, there's just so much involvement we can do, but yes, the African countries would be involved and also have to probably compete among each other as to where the headquarters would be. So it's sort of a spoke. Anyway, I don't want to go into details,
All
but
right. It's great to have a question that provokes a happy
pro-
answer.
Yeah, pro-poor, pro-gender university, so that African students can, if they can afford to go, they would get paid for that. And in 30-year time frame, 40-year time frame, it'll be self-supporting through an endowment. But meanwhile, everybody would pitch in. We had an agreement from the Ethiopian government to headquarter there because we thought with the African Union and everything, but of course now with the war, I've pulled back my personal support for that because I don't think that's the place to locate it right now.
Locating in permanent peace is an issue. Yeah. One question here, then there, and then we'll take one from Zoom. Or yeah, please.
Thank you. My name is Bailey Wong, and I am a Master of Arts in Law and Diplomacy first-year student. My question is also for you, Ambassador, with regard to the discussion that you mentioned about regional institutions that we might partner with, particularly around East Asia and Southeast Asia, as a way of maybe finding solutions to conflict with China. How do you think that the relationship with our partners there and allies might be perhaps mitigated with the danger of the security dilemma, and particularly as we might consider NATO's enlargement causing some concern for Russia and perhaps even provoking actions in Ukraine? Is that relevant, and how might we mitigate that relationship?
Well, I hope my colleagues will chime in actually with some thoughts on that. But in Asia, well, the Pacific Island Forum is the largest one. But in Asia, we've got ASEAN, we've got APEC. We have a whole list of ones that I tried to come up with just to jog my memory as to what's out there. We have the ASEAN Regional Forum, which talks about politics and other things. So there are many avenues where we participate. Of course, we had the TPP before we didn't. And then so that, you know, that we need to show up. We need to show up at a proper level. We need to be able to then follow through, because American follow through now is questionable. People over the global South countries, I hate talking about all of them, but many have calibrated now their timeline down to our timeline. What will happen in the US for the fall elections in 2022? Then what will happen when the presidential election? So their timeline for us has been reduced. Can they depend on us? What will we do as a country? And so we need to go back to what Republican Senator, was it Thank you. In 1947, I think he said, politics stops at the water's edge. We have to get back to that if we can politically inside this country, because if without that, we dilute the force of our what we do overseas. So I'll stop there and let
And
others talk.
maybe we could just expand this in two directions. One is whether any of these organizations have a military role in balancing, but also I wanted to draw on, you mentioned the TTP that we didn't have. The summit in Los Angeles was rather noticeable for not having any really serious economic dimensions. We've announced an economic policy that's sort of a stand-in for the TTP, except it's got a lot of little bells and whistles around the edges and doesn't actually seem to engage. And we had an interesting lesson when we walked out of the TTP. China walked in and helped negotiate an agreement that has them in and us out. So are we seeing a move kind of across the board that the United States, with its own popular political views of international trade, is simply not able to engage internationally the way it needs to in future trade agreements?
That's a good question, and I'm not sure how to answer it. The traditional support for free trade agreements is not there. Free trade. Anyway, we are in a state of flux
And
ourselves. I don't know.
and Ron, you know, I know the Senate would never approve a trade agreement at this point.
Yeah.
So even if we were to negotiate TTIP or TPP or one of these other free trade agreements, it will never be ratified by the Senate. So at that point, it becomes a very
So you're left
Exercise.
working around a lot of different margins on hugely important trade issues because you can't go to the center.
right.
Jamie, over to you before we leave this question on the military relevance or irrelevance of many of these regional organizations.
Well, I think, as far as treaties go out in the Western Pacific, and, my time, I haven't sailed out there, but I was involved in that negotiation with China, is very important. Our traditional treaty allies, the strongest probably being Japan, of course, Korea, Thailand, but they've had problems politically and domestically. Come back a little bit on that. The Philippines, up and down through the reign of Duterte. And now we have the Quad. And there is a big military aspect to that because Phil Davidson, when he was into PACOM, sort of brought that thing back into focus. But it's been disappointing with India's failure to sanction Russia and failure to shun Russian goods. I don't blame Modi. He's got a lot of people's mouths to feed and a lot of homes to heat. But the Quad hasn't been effective in rallying the allies and partners. And of course, AUKUS. So that's out in the Pacific region. Things that help us in Europe, of course, are NATO, and NATO's expanded its reach to other places too, like Africa. And I've spent quite a bit of time down there. And those alliances with the African Union, the 5 standing armies, are extremely important. You mentioned, and there was a question earlier, this young man asked about, you answered about the educational opportunities for Africans in China versus the United States. And my experience was, just take Cabo Verde, for example. The Cabo Verdeans, they like Americans. They were all whalers. They have relatives in Delaware and Rhode Island. There's 250,000 Cabo Verdeans in the United States. And yet, our international military education and training funding to them is about $125,000 a year. That doesn't even buy you one seat at the Naval War College because the cost is expensive. It's about 200 and something. So you have to wait every other year to put somebody at the Naval War College. The Chinese rolled in and said, how many seats do you want? And they said, how many can we have? 40, 50, you name it. And that's happening in all 54 countries on the continent with the Confucius centers. It's quite frankly brilliant. It's a great strategy. People learn your language, and they can go to your country, and they can be educated, and there'll be a certain amount of loyalty there. So, you know, she's been at this for a long time, and it's very effective. We're not going to be able to compete unless we can figure this out. So your point was very well taken.
So far, the students have been very good in asking short, disciplined questions that have provoked us into very long answers. We got to find a way to deal with this. So I'm going to, sir, you're next, and then I'm going to take one, Alex, from the Zoom world, and maybe we could take both together, although they may go in different directions, and we'll see what we can do.
Hi, my name is David Mulkey. I'm the State Department Fellow at Fletcher this year.
All right.
Nice to meet you. My question, I think, is probably most directed at Admiral Fogo to follow up on AUKUS, the Australia, UK, US alliance, and of course, last year's pretty blockbuster announcement about nuclear submarine and other types of cooperation. I'm curious about your reactions to that. Will this help? I was struck by your slide showing that budgetarily, the US Navy, we just can't keep up if things go the way they are. Is something like AUKUS and this type of cooperation the way of the future for us? Is that a thesis you subscribe to? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the question.
Before you do that, I want to get one more in from the Zoom. We'll take them together.
Yeah.
Great.
Even though they may not be together.
Yeah, it's in a completely different direction.
That's all right. We'll handle it.
Okay, so the question is, can you please speak about the consequences of renewed great power competition for multilateral cooperation at the United Nations? Do you foresee a potential Security Council gridlock akin to the Cold War taking place again? Thank you.
Okay, Jamie, you get to start on.
Yeah, so great question. I laud AUKUS, although at the same time, this is something very difficult to do, to build a nuclear powered submarine in a place that has never had one before. And we have 70 years of experience in this country, thanks to Admiral Hyman G. Rickover, but we went through a lot of growing pains in order to do that. And we have a 0 accident rating, so that's going to be a requirement. There is no, there's no other way to do this. So expensive, long-term, difficult. Some Navy spokesman said we don't have an industrial base to support our own needs, so how can we support Australia's? I think you can get this done. But the nice thing about AUKUS is bigger than just a submarine. It's an alliance, and Deep Blue is going on up in Ottawa, Canada right now. I was in the conference last year. It's about it's a security conference. I say, when does AUKUS become caucus? When is Canada part of this? When does it expand to other nations? You know, and the point is that everybody can talk and work together and try to, you know, provide alternatives to some of the lesser enticing alternatives that China puts on the table. And then one comment, and I'll leave the ambassadors to answer the UN question. But you remember back in the campaign in Libya that when the UN Security Council resolution came out around 19 March of 2011 that authorized use of military force in Libya, I think Russia and China abstained from the vote. I don't see that ever happening in the future. They'll veto it. So getting any kind of collective action going, and particularly in a place like Ukraine, is very, very difficult. You've got to have a big coalition of the willing. You may not get the legal mandate from the UN Security Council. It's going to make life more difficult. Over to my friends, the diplomats, to take that one on too.
Kathleen?
Yeah, just to follow up on that, I mean, you make a very good point. And I think what we're going to start seeing in the UN Security Council, among the P5, you're going to see a lot more assertive China, where in the past, Russia was driving a lot of the discussions, and China would often follow the example of what Russia did. I think in this case, you're going to start seeing a much more assertive China in P5 deliberations. You're also going to see probably some more movement to try to expand the P5, but of course, there'll never be a consensus which countries belong in the P5. So it'll just become much more of a stagnant, paralyzed body in many more ways.
Look, we've been through long periods of time.
Yeah.
If I could just say, China and Russia are blocking discussion of putting on the agenda the issue of the Ethiopian war in the Security Council. So they're cooperating together there. And also they're sometimes stating to some African countries that they'll argue for that particular country to come into the, you know, Security Council or whatever. But I noticed the UN has a South-South grouping that is promising. as well as one on racism, which I think is promising. When I say promising, 20, 30 years. I mean, if you look at what Ambassador Ralph Bunche did in setting up the breaking down of colonialism, it took a while, but he set up a committee that eventually helped eliminate that.
Now, it'd be nice if we can manage to work with that instead of having our short-term approach. I remember in one previous administration, we used to call that one meeting diplomacy. Once we've told you what we want, there's no reason to meet with you again. Ma'am, you got the next question.
Sure. Thank you so much for your time. My name is Cassandra Cronin. I'm a first-year MALD student. I'm also a 2022 Wrangell Fellow and a Foreign Policy for America alum. My question is along the lines of, so Congress appropriated billions and billions of dollars more than what was requested in this year's National Defense Authorization Act. So it really shocked me, Admiral Fogo, to hear you say that there's still not enough money, particularly for the Navy. I mean, what's missing here? What can Congress or other actors be doing to make sure that the Pentagon is more adequately funded, as well as make sure that enough money is being allocated to the State Department as well to make sure that we're using all the tools in our toolbox effectively and able to compete on the global stage? Thank you.
So thank you very
But
much.
a short answer.
Yeah.
And then I'm going to channel Tony Cornisman to make life difficult.
Thanks very much for the question. And you're absolutely right. So the problem is that purchasing power that's less than last year, because we really need 3 to 5% above inflation. Now, Elaine Luria and Rep Golden got all the services, $37.5 billion more. 40% of that goes to the Navy. That's some relief. But with that submarine, that deterrent submarine at 16 billion, and then the next one something less, and then eventually down to 9 billion, really takes away your ability to build ships over the long term and compete with China. So we got to do something different. And that's a function of the way we do our industrial base. And we do have labor unions. We do represent rights of workers. It is more expensive. Congress says we can't build overseas. You can do it at a fraction of the cost in Korea. So there's other alternatives. We've got to be creative. And however, I think.
But part of the way we do business is our budgeting process. It's our design process. I won't argue about it because I don't have the depth to argue with you on this, but certainly reading my old friend Tony Cornisman on the defense budget, and if any of you are interested, he publishes on the CSIS website, it's a scathing indictment of our inability to prioritize, to do proper cost analysis, and to control our appetite for adjustments to programs. So that one issue is money, and it's a big issue. But another issue is within our own domain, within the services as well, which is to get discipline of ourselves. Self-discipline is not perhaps one of our best known national characteristics, but we have a need for it. By the way, congratulations on being ranked. But one over here.
Hello, my name is Joseph Lim. I'm a senior at Tufts University taking courses at the Fletcher School. My question was simple regarding the status of back channels and track 2 diplomacy in these days and how the US can expand them over time. And particularly a question for Admiral Fogo. Did you ever meet Admiral Leachy later on in your life following the 2014 meeting? Thank you. So I guess it's addressed to all.
Well, track 2, and I think those are all important and should be expanded. I don't have a feel for how much we're doing now, but diplomacy is yes for the professionals, but also for the informal groupings.
Now, we have a long history of various track 2 things, some of which work better than others. My father used to be part of a dialogue with the Soviets, which was unofficial on our side because everybody was out of government. We had people like Evgeny Primakov on their side who was not terribly out. The track 2 third-party things can, a huge generalization here. One of their abilities, one of their real utilities is the ability to be able to put forward ideas that you're not fully responsible for. So one of the big issues you have in many negotiations, Americans have this notion that you go into a negotiation and say, well, if I give you A, would you give me B? In many countries, if you say that, the mental reaction is, now I know I can get A. So let's put that in my pocket, not say yes, and push for a little more, like buying a rug in the souk. And so if you understand that, then you're also inhibited about making that kind of offer. Where in a third party discussion, or in a discussion with a third party, or when nobody is speaking officially for your side, then you can explore, if they gave you A, would you give B? But it's not saying I'll do it. There's no commitment. You haven't foreshadowed a position. And this is one of the huge strengths of kind of track 2 stuff. One of the debilities can be sort of that people can kind of put on an act. I think we had a lot of that with Taliban negotiations in track 2 discussions, and an awful lot of people bought into notions that there was now a new and moderate Taliban, which is so far not terribly inevitable. But there's a lot of value in track 2 stuff. I'm not sure if I'm responding exactly to what you wanted to know, but you opened an interesting question. Sir.
Thank you very much. Good evening. My name is Lorenzo Revello. I'm a second year math student from the European side and Fulbright fellow. My question is for Admiral Fogo, because you gave a very good representation how China is outnumbering our ships, how they are very good in hypersonic. So from the Europeans, and you also said that Pentagon is spending every year more or less $700 billion. In Europe now, Germany committed from an extra 100 billion euro each year. So I think NATO overall spends $1 trillion. So if I can put myself in the shoes of a countryman, my provocative question is, how badly are we spending our money? Because of course, China has cheaper costs while producing navies, blah, 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 but we're spending $1 trillion every year. So should we cut, or really, are you asking for even more money? Thank you.
Thank you. The Chief of Naval Operations just said he's got to have that 3 to 5% above the top line in order to account for inflation. And that's to build a fleet by 2045. And the big problem with the leaders in the Pacific are they don't want to be Husband Kimball or General Short in Pearl Harbor in World War II. They want it now, now, now. So if it's not relevant by the Davidson window of 2027, where Davidson says that China will do something to Taiwan by then, we'll have to react. It doesn't work. But we have all these problems with industrial base, cost overruns, systems that are too expensive, too complicated for sailors to operate. So we could probably figure out a better way to do it. The Chinese don't have to deal with the labor issue, and it's a lot of their stuff's nationalized, so they have an advantage. But you're right, it's a lot of money, and don't get me wrong, I think a lot of that money can be spent elsewhere. And the reason I put that submarine slide up there is it wasn't that the Navy doesn't have a lot of money to do what it needs to do, but that should be a national bill. That should come out of other cabinets, not just the Navy, because it is for our nuclear deterrence for our entire nation. The CNO tried to sell that to the rest of government, and the answer was, no, we're not going to do that. The Navy will pay the bill. So it's a handicap for the next few years until that boat gets out. Where are you from?
One here from this lady and one from online.
Good evening. Thank you so much for this excellent opportunity to engage with you. My name is Soumya, and I'm a second-year MALD student. And I'd like to shift the focus to the Indo-Pacific and specifically to India. I'm curious as to how you think the US will respond to India's position of strategic autonomy, which I think is frustrating, but also justifiable in many ways. Just look at our neighbors to the left and our right, and with Afghanistan now. India hasn't had a permanent US ambassador in the past 18 months, over 18 months, which has been the longest time since that has happened. So I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on.
I'm going to let maybe end at the military, but I just want to note that there's nothing personal in the American incapacity which has produced the lack of an ambassador. We do not have an ambassador in Egypt. We don't have an ambassador named for Colombia, as far as I know. We had a blockage between the National Security Council and the State Department that had prevented us from even putting forth a candidate for ambassador to Russia until suddenly John Sullivan left just a little bit early because he well known he was going to leave. This administration is falling on its face in nominating ambassadors to major countries. Trump administration was bad enough, and it had probably a higher percentage of absolute incompetence that embarrassed us. But this administration is not covering itself with glory at all. It has been very slow out the gate. It has some pretty unusual political nominees. It's some very good, but when you send a political nominee with no diplomatic experience whatsoever to a Finland or a Norway in the middle of confrontations with Russia, this is kind of like rolling the dice in a crapshoot to see if they're going to be qualified or not. So there's a lot of problems, but don't take it personally. Okay, over to you on the military piece of that.
Yeah, so,
but short, because we're going to get through quite a few folk here.
Right. So, on the issue of the importance of India and building relationships, Navy to Navy, we're like brothers. There's exchange of ships. They're coming over and getting excess defense articles. It's a great relationship. My old speechwriter who's got a PhD from Oxford is over there. We communicate all the time. And the ambassador thing needs to get fixed. The Navy has something called the Foreign Area Officer Program. There are 2 flag officers, 2 admirals in that program. We always send one to China, one to Russia. Guess where we sent the one of the 2 this year? To India. Hallelujah. I think that's great. India and Pakistan have issues, but India is not necessarily very friendly with China. And so I think there's an opportunity for Americans here, and I hope we get that ambassador bill filled.
Let me take 2 together. The questions may not jibe, but we'll get 2 because we're going to have to move along. We are going to run over a little bit. We're programmed to stop now. We're going to run over about another 10 minutes. I have Dean Kite's agreement to that. And but at that point, it's going to be a hard stop and we're bugging out the door. So 2 questions over here.
Thanks a lot for your great talk. My name is Xuan and I'm from China and I'm a first-year MOD student. My question goes to Ambassador Kathleen. And sorry, I have to write down things in case I'm very nervous to speak in front of people in case I had a panic attack or something. Yeah. So I think the dollar price is getting higher and higher, and it's affect us as an international students. So for example, in the beginning of the year, like for example, $1 we buy like the Chinese yuan is 6.3, and now it's over 7 yuan per dollar. And it is a lot, especially we are in an expensive graduate school and city. And not just me, I believe other students from other countries have the same concerns too. So, and honestly, we are quite privileged to be able to study in the States. And how about the people like in the Globe South countries with like struggling living, and especially in the post-pandemic period, and whether increase or keep US dollar price really works for US diplomacy, and how do policymakers balance like great power competition and their nation interest along with the lives of ordinary people and human security in general? Thank you.
So on the value of the dollar, there's a lot of factors of why it is so high right now, and part of it is the US represents stability in a world of instability, and you can argue how stable we are, but in comparison to what's going on in the world, and traditionally investors have always gone to the US as a safe haven, and that's not something that any government official can control or no want to control. And honestly, there's been a bit of debate in the United States whether a strong dollar is good or bad for us. Domestically, it's probably bad for our exporters, but for a foreign policy standpoint, it's actually very important right now to this. I think eventually we'll start seeing the value of the dollar start adjusting downward, but not for the foreseeable future, partly because of this instability in the world right now. It does, and it is a very effective foreign policy tool, which is not seen as a traditional tool, but the value of a dollar is very effective in terms of a coercive behavior. But it does build resentment, not just among students who have to pay in the conversion rate, but in the debt that's held by other countries.
Yeah, there's a huge question out there. How much resentment, where's the break point? between the use of our leverage, and we've used it more and more, and where do you get so much resentment that it actually takes action that lowers your strength in the future?
Yeah.
And we don't have an answer. One question here and then one here.
Good evening. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
My name is Walter Streeter. I'm a second-year MALD student, and I wanted to build off a point that Admiral Fogo made a couple questions back. We mentioned that the Philippines was particularly affected by China's island building campaign. Over the Rodrigo Duterte presidency, he's fairly explicit about his disregard for the United States and comparative openness to China. But now that there's a new president in power, is there an opportunity to better engage with the Philippines, possibly include them in the Quad or other international bodies? What do you think? And this question goes out
And
to all.
don't
of you.
answer yet. We're gonna take one over here.
Yeah.
Thank you. And I am an MGA student and I'm from Ethiopia.
Can you stand just a little closer to the microphone? Thank you.
I'm a bit nervous, so it's,
That's all right. Take your time.
So I am an MGA student and I'm from Ethiopia, so another representation from Africa, but I came on by my own terms, so no funding there. So my question relates with, I feel like there is a missing link in this great power competition. So we're talking about, especially if we take the what's happening in the Horn of Africa, there is a miss which I didn't hear from the panel in the role of middle powers, like what the role of Middle Eastern countries and their interest in their political and economic interest in the Horn of Africa, affecting the policies of the US, for instance, and the global power competition in the Red Sea dynamics as well. And especially what is happening in Ethiopia, in Sudan, in the entire region, cannot be understood without the impact of the growing impact of Middle Eastern powers. So how is that reconciled with the great power competition? Thank you.
Do you want to start in the Philippines? And I'll make a few comments, and then Bree, I'm sure, wants to get in on it. Yep. Sorry, Jimmy.
So on the Philippines, yeah, Duterte, a lot of rhetoric, but there is still, the US is still using facilities in the Philippines. It's a great location for launch of ships and other things. And the money was flowing through that whole time. So there was some grandstanding there. I think with the Kino, there's an opportunity. So we'll continue. Philippines are great people. It's always a pleasure to go there. And I think that relationship will probably blossom under new leadership. I'm happy about that.
On this question of middle powers, this is a fascinating issue because you're seeing a number of powers which now have had a greatly increased economic potential. Their military potential is not as great. There's an imbalance. So they can play certain kinds of roles. What you're seeing, first of all, is there are powers, and particularly the UAE, United Arab Emirates, and Saudi Arabia under Mohammed bin Salman, are seeing themselves with a different vision of global interest or regional interests. So you're seeing particularly the UAE expanding into the Red Sea area. But you saw this in Libya, where you had suddenly, UAE and Egypt on, because they have a view driven, it's not so much a view that they wish to expand power, it's a view that of where their threat comes from. And they see a threat from the Muslim Brotherhood, they see a much larger Muslim, what you might call fundamentalist jihadi threat than we actually have seen writ large. And they're now prepared to put money into their version of threat. So you had us running one kind of policy in Libya, and they're running another one. And they're bankrolling it with weapons and money. This produces weird lineups sometimes because Russia was essentially running the same not really the same policy, but the same policy outcome. That got reversed. You're seeing it also in the Persian Gulf itself, or as my Navy friends like to call it, the Arabian Gulf, because all of our friends are Arabs and they want to call it the Arabian Gulf. But what you're seeing is a doubt about the United States. Yeah.
Yeah.
Is that my mic? Yeah. Oh, well, that's okay. We can pass some around here or something.
Yeah.
What you're seeing there is a destabilization in this great power conflict in the Persian Gulf because the United States has been pulling back. And so there's a growing doubt in major oil producing countries, which have an impact on our economy, about whether they can really count on the United States. There was a sort of understood implicit bargain for years that we got oil and they got a certain degree of security. And that began to come apart first under President Trump. And then there was this, Afghanistan influenced this because with President Trump, you had a sense the United States was pulling back into a much more US-centric policy. And then Biden administration comes in, we're back, a lot of talk. But then Afghanistan comes along. Biden administration goes out, consults heavily with the European NATO allies, ignores everything they have to say, makes the decision unilaterally to pull out. Focused on US interests. Not talking about whether it's a good or bad decision, but that brought back this question, well, wait a minute, is this the new direction of the US? That it is much more disengaged from much of the world? You know, is Biden's policy Trump with a smiley face? Now, that's been somewhat overshadowed of late because of Ukraine and because of our standing so staunchly there and pulling Europeans together. But in the Persian Gulf, you have a lot of states that are not sure where the United States will be if there is a confrontation, say, with Iran. So that has heavily influenced their movement to Israel, which from our point of view is a good thing, but probably is much more about security than about peace. But it's unstable because they're looking around for other security guarantors. But there's nobody else of the dimensions of the United States to play that role. So you're under, in a way you have, I wouldn't say our role is coming apart, but it's weakened. It's not as central as it was, and yet there's nothing taking its place that's very dependable. And that's in the Gulf. You've got some very specific issues then as well in the Sudan, which I won't try to get into because I'm not expert on that. Reed, you want to say anything more? Should we move on?
We should get the last two questions.
Okay, let's get the last two questions.
Thank you for the wonderful insights.
In really short questions, we're gonna have really short answers here. But go.
Sure. Thank you for the wonderful insights, ambassadors. My question was that this great power competition was historically termed as or framed as democracy versus the authoritarian / totalitarian regimes. And when we see during the Ukrainian war that almost half or near to half of the Asian and African countries did either abstained or rejected the first resolution of immediate withdrawal of Russian forces from Ukraine, what does that indicate or imply about the penetration of democratic values or democratic ideals of the United States among these largest democracies, and also about the future of this great power competition as one of democracies against the penetration of authoritarianism? Thank you.
Thank you. It's a great question. Let me get one more question, then we're going to try to do a final wrap here.
My name is Sarah Singh. I'm a first-year MALD student. This question is for Admiral Fogo. Regarding China's salami slicing strategy, is that slowing down? Have they faced any consequences for that? And what do you think it would take for them to stop the salami slicing?
Okay, we got to wrap in about a minute and a half apiece here. On your democracy question, it's a fascinating one because I think there's a tension which is going to grow between the question of stability and the question of democratization. It was great to come in with the Biden administration and say, we're all about democracy. And in the Ukrainian effort, most of the real players are more or less fellow democratic states. But when you move into other areas of the world and you start looking at competition, you are thrown back intellectually on a great deal of tension between, are you really about democracy or are you about stabilization, and destabilization require that you work with people who are not democratic? And that's obviously not one we're going to resolve tonight, but it is, I think, going to be a bigger and bigger question for the United States, particularly because we have a terrible problem dealing with that kind of question in our politics, because it's ultimately you cannot have one or the other. It's just not a choice you have. But we don't want to deal with nuance. We don't want to deal with that balance. And so our tendency is to overstate the ideological commitment and then not do it and then be accused of hypocrisy. I predict that at least that cycle will continue for some time. Jamie, you want to talk about the military, and then I want to give just a minute to each of my other colleagues, to Kathleen and to Reed, for any final comments.
Absolutely. Great question about the salami slicing. What price has China paid? They got beat handsomely in the International Court, UN Convention Law of the Sea, in the cases of the Rock Shoals and Islands around the Philippines. No consequences because President Duterte chose not to make an issue of it. Where they're suffering is in this concept of a wolf warrior and buyer's remorse of many countries: Sri Lanka, Sao Tome and Principe in the Gulf of Guinea, Ghana, and others who've had their areas fished out with IUUF. So there are those consequences. There are the consequences of debt warfare and what that does to countries. Last thing I'll say is, when I was in China, they held up one of my old prof's books, Soft Power by Joe Nye. They said, "Have you seen this?" And I said, "Yes, I have. I have an autographed copy of it." They said, "This is soft power. We know how to do soft power." I don't think so. I don't think there's any school of diplomacy there. It's going to hurt them in the long term.
Yeah. I just wanted to say that what I was struck by this omission of discussion about the issue of rare earths and the battleground over that. And that's actually, look at the Democratic Republic of Congo, where you're seeing it play out on the front lines. And we didn't really talk a lot about the battle over technology and the future of AI and quantum computing and where that's going to play. I was actually struck by the conversation we had with somewhat more of a traditional nature rather than the kind of cutting edge issues. So I'm just going to leave you with the thought about, there's a whole new frontier and battlegrounds that we haven't really even begun to talk about. And that's where I think it's going to be actually a world of a lot of confrontation, adversarial adversaries, competition, and very little cooperation.
That's probably a lot of people who aren't your friend on every issue.
And I'll just add on the democracy part and the countries that abstain, not to overdraw a conclusion from that. I think that would put us in a box that we don't need to be in, number one. Number two, the coverage in this country, at least, was for African countries that didn't do. And that gets back into that racial aspect of that redounds into our domestic politics. And I think we have to be careful about that. But I will mention that as something that's out there that diplomats are going to have to deal with and should deal with.
That really does bring us to the end of this program. I thank you for having us here. Thank you for sponsoring this program. Carol, Sisco, thank you for making it possible. But thank you to all of you. Those were great questions. They were thoughtful, they were provocative, and another 10 hours we might have been able to go easily. So thank you all.
Right.